Hey everyone, it's May, and welcome to another episode of the May Lee Show. Hope you guys are doing okay. Every day is something else, right? Every day there's some sort of chaos or violence or hate crime or a shooting going on, and so it's hard to kind of get through the day sometimes. But I find myself trying to talk about ways in which we can continue to have conversations that are useful, that are constructive. And so this show is going to talk about something that is a fairly new concept. It's been around for about 2 decades or so, but it's just starting to come up in conversation more often now. And it's the idea of restorative justice. Restorative justice. And I'm going to simplify it for the time being, but we're going to get into it in the interview that I recorded with somebody who knows a lot more about it. But it's really the idea of, instead of punishing someone by sending them to prison in the traditional way for a crime committed, it's the idea of rehabilitation and community and finding more sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of more healing ways to get this person from where he or she is, this place of either violence or drug use or whatever crime they're committing, to a place where they can feel whole again. So the idea of restorative justice is something that keeps on coming up now, in the age of incarceration being touted as not the answer, right? We know from many, many reports and constant conversation and stories that are done on the prison system that it's failing. It's not working well. People do not come out of prison as better people. Well, some do. Majority do not, and they repeat offenders. We know about this just recently from the story of the Filipino woman, the 65-year-old woman in New York who got beat up by that guy outside of a building. And we found out that he had murdered his own mother at the age of 19 and went to prison for many, many years, then was released on lifetime parole. And he ended up committing this hate crime. So yeah, imprisonment often doesn't work. And so restorative justice is something that is being talked about more and more. So I was in a Clubhouse chat not too long ago, and this person reached out to me because I guess he saw that I was on. And his name is David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris. Great name. He has an organization that's called Amplify RJ, Restorative Justice. And so this is a young man who decided to really start investigating and researching and trying to educate in terms of the idea of restorative justice. So he reached out to me because he thought, can we have a conversation about this, given all the anti-Asian hate crimes and also the other criminal activity that's going on within other, communities of color. So I decided to invite him on the show to have this conversation because I think it's needed, and also for educational purposes. I have to admit, I didn't know much about restorative justice at all until I started researching it, because I kept on hearing about it more and more. So this is an episode where I want it to be just sort of introductory, informative, for many of us who really don't know a lot about restorative justice. So here is that interview that I did with David, and I'll see you on the other side of it. Hey, David, welcome to the show. Good to have you.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here, and wishing that, we weren't having to have this conversation, but glad to be here.
I think it's necessary. And we had spoken before. We had a private conversation, about a month ago about the whole idea of restorative justice. And we were saying that we wanted to do this at some point. So here we are. So, I think restorative justice is a concept that has been around, but it's being talked about more of late, given the sort of conflicts that we're seeing constantly, in this country. So let's start with a brief definition of restorative justice, just in case people who are listening and watching aren't really sure what it means.
Yeah, I'm going to give two. One is a definition that has existed for a while, at least since 1990, from a man named Howard Zur. He is who some would call the quote unquote grandfather of restorative justice, although he's not the person who came up with it. He defines restorative justice as a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in the specific offense and to collectively identify and address the needs, harms, and obligations caused by that harm in order to heal and put things as right as possible. That's a Zur definition. When I think about restorative justice, I think about it a little bit more expansively. I think about, again, this philosophy and set of practices rooted in indigenous practices and philosophies of interconnection by repairing harm in relationships when it happens, but also proactively building and maintaining relationships to prevent future harm. So, two definitions for consideration.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the both. But at the core of the idea of restorative justice is really trying to resolve, a conflict or some sort of pain or crime, even
Mhm.
uh, not in a punitive way, like the traditional just throw them in jail and that's it, throw away the key. It's really trying to rehabilitate. It's trying to educate, inform. Right? Am I right about that?
Yeah, so when you think about a Zur definition, that's correct. And I think when we think back to the indigenous roots of how people were together, right? When we were in small groups, say of 150, kicking someone out of your tribe, your group, right, meant death for them and a significant loss to your community. So it's in all of our interests to figure out a way to work things out together, acknowledging our interconnection, right? And so when you do that, it is how do we move forward together in the best way? It's probably about repairing relationships or
Mm,
creating a relationship if that didn't really exist before. And
right.
I understand that we live in a world with much more than 150 people, right?
Yeah.
And we have systems that are built to try to facilitate that kind of repair or solving conflict. But I don't think those systems often do a good job of really meeting the needs of anybody involved.
Right. Before we get deeper into this, I should have asked you at the top, why did you get into restorative justice, the cause of restorative justice and being behind this and being so active about it? What was it about the concept that drew you to this?
Yeah, the short version of it is that I was working in an employment program when I was 22, 23 years old, helping people find work. And those who had records in the criminal legal system were those who were having the most difficult time finding work, right?
Right.
A lot of the times it was for drugs. And so in my mind, I started not just thinking about who are the felon friendly employers, but what are the root causes for them to end up here in the first place, right? Why are we treating drug problems like criminal legal problems instead of health problems? That led me to learn more about the war on drugs and mass incarceration and all the factors that contribute to that, right? The school to prison pipeline, often the foster care to prison pipeline, homelessness, mental illness, right? All those things being criminalized. And restorative justice offers a different set of questions. Instead of asking, like, what rule or law was broken, who did it, and how can we punish them? It's what happened, who is impacted, and how, and what can we do to make this right? And that kind of set me on the path of learning so much more.
Ah, okay. Okay. Gotcha. So then let's turn to why we're talking about this today. And it has to do with all the anti Asian hate assaults and crimes that are taking place across the country and around the world. We're hearing about it everywhere. But let's stick to the US for now. This is a daily occurrence, sometimes multiple times a day. It's been happening for a year and a half. We all know the data now. We've all heard over 3,800 reports, of these hate crimes and assaults. And there's a lot of anger, right?
Mhm.
As you know, there's a lot of anger, and people are pissed and they want justice, right? You keep hearing that. We want justice, we want these people found. And the immediate response is, we want justice, the cops have to get involved and they need to be arrested, they need to be jailed, whatever, right? They need to be convicted of a hate crime.
Mhm.
This is what we're hearing. And
Right.
we get that. I mean, you and I, you're part Asian. I mean, we all know why people are angry. I'm angry. I'm
Mhm.
angry when I see an elderly person being shoved to the ground and killed. So the idea of restorative justice for some might be like, well, screw that. that person doesn't deserve that kind of treatment. So how can we deal with that and kind of come to terms with the idea of restorative justice when there's this kind of division and anger going on?
Yeah, I think the first part is acknowledging that that anger exists for a reason. That anger is often righteous, and I totally understand where that's coming from. Where I have questions is, what do we mean when we say justice,
Yeah.
right? If you're talking about justice as just having someone be caught and locked up in prison for an indefinite amount of time, right? You can put a you can put a time frame on it, or say lock them up forever. What need is that meeting?
Yeah.
You're probably meeting the need for having that person off the street and not being able to cause harm anymore. I'll admit that that's something that the criminal legal system does pretty well.
Right.
Oftentimes, when someone is sentenced for something like this, they're not going away for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So they're going to come back out,
Right.
right? And what are they going to come back out to do? What are they going to come back into, right? If you're putting somebody in a box, right, with other people who have caused harm and not offering them anything to heal, learn, do anything to improve themselves, they're not going to come out better for that. Sometimes people do have these epiphanies within the context of a prison or jail or incarceration, right? But that's not generally the case. And so they're going to come back on the street even more pissed off about those group of people who like ended me up in here. And like, I'm not saying that that is a correct logical assumption for them, but that's often what happens, right? When we're asking, like, what does justice mean in this situation? I think restorative justice would say, a restorative justice philosophy would say, it's acknowledgement of harm, right? Taking responsibility for that harm, changing your behavior. And if you don't know how to change that behavior, learning and adapting the skills. And that's incredibly so much more work than just sitting in a jail cell.
Oh,
right?
yeah. And that's exactly what I was just going to ask you then. Yes, I mean, if someone could be rehabilitated and educated and informed and become a changed person through a program of some sort, that's great. That's what you want, right? You don't want someone to sit in jail on taxpayer money and then come out the
Right,
same
yeah.
person or even worse, right? That's a terrible result. So it doesn't make sense. But when it comes to that kind of program or that kind of rehabilitation, does it exist? I mean, that's the problem. We don't even take care of people with drug addiction properly. And so
Mhm.
therefore that cycle never is broken. So something like restorative justice programs and rehabilitation, does that even exist? I mean, I'm coming from somebody who doesn't know. So tell
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
So I think like this might be surprising coming from me. Like, I don't think the criminal legal system adapting restorative justice is the right way to go about things, right? We can't rely on a system that's just like super good at punishment and being litigious and like following the exact letter of the law, really caring about the needs of a person who was harmed in a situation,
Right.
or the person who caused harm, or really the communities that were impacted, right? One of the things that we didn't talk about is in this situation where somebody is put in jail for an indefinite amount of time, the criminal legal system does nothing for the person who was harmed, right? It's kind of just like, well, we got them for you, the state of whatever versus this person.
Right.
We lock them up. The person who was harmed, good luck. Sometimes there are victim services. A lot of times it's just the community around them, if they have community supporting them. Restorative justice, when it's done in community, in the context of relationships, it looks really closely at what the people involved in these situations need, right? It's going to be safety, right? It's going to be community support, spiritual, mental, physical, emotional, right? Sometimes there's monetary damages that need to be repaid. And in a case like this, the person who caused harm might not have that money, right? So how can
Oh, yeah.
community be supportive of that, right? It's not just about, pawning off our problem solving to, the state through these processes. Like, what are our responsibilities as community members to take care of people, right? Going back to these ideas of interconnection, like taking care of the people who are reflections of us, who impact us. And that's not an easy cut and dry answer, right? It looks different in almost every situation. I think there are frameworks that can happen. One of the catalysts for us having this specific conversation in this time is, in December, there was a man, a Chinese American man who chose to remain anonymous in Portland, who was punched in the face by a white man named Daniel Hutchins. There was an article that NetShark and Yahoo and a couple other places put out about how this Chinese American man asked that Daniel Hutchins, the white man who punched him in the face, not be given a jail sentence, but was asking for him to go through a restorative process, right? Because that's what he believed would prevent this kind of harm from happening again.
Right.
And so the Oregon Chinese Coalition, I believe, stepped up and decided that, hey, we're going to work with Daniel to help him go through this process of unlearning the white supremacy that he's been taught, the assumptions that he has about people of Asian descent, teaching him the history of our people, right? And figuring out ways to help him repair the harm that he's caused, not just to this one Chinese man, but to the Asian American community in the greater Portland area at large.
Right.
And, as Asian American people across the world, I don't know that it's his responsibility to fix all of that, but like, what are the things that you can do to stop that harm in other places? That's what a restorative process looks like for me in this situation. And the nuances of that, are for Daniel and the people involved to figure out. But when you put this in the hands of the criminal legal system, I don't know that that's exactly the place that this will work well, because people have very little incentive to say like, yep, I did it, I admit it, because the criminal legal system is just really, really good at punishment.
Yeah, well, I think that's the whole point of it, right? Is just that immediate punishment as the end all be all answer. And so in this Oregon case, like you're mentioning, yeah, I mean, that's unusual, right? That a victim would say, okay, I want this person to be re-educated, and then for the community, like you're suggesting, to step forward and say, okay, we'll take on that responsibility of trying to re-educate this person and make him a better man. It'll be interesting to see what the end result is, but that's one example that of restorative justice. But otherwise, we're not hearing about this, certainly. And again, like you're saying, you mentioned, it's people go to jail for a crime and then they get out and they, might do the same thing or something else. Well, that guy in New York, the man who beat the living daylights out of the 65-year-old Filipina on her way to church, that guy was put in jail for
killing his
mother at the age of 19, and then he was released. And so clearly this cycle of violence was not broken. And so again, that is what's stirring people up about like, well, these people can't be reprogrammed in any way. And why should we waste our time doing this when they're out on the streets committing these crimes against innocent people? So that's the tough sell, isn't it? I think it's a pretty tough sell.
Well, I mean, I think in that case specifically, you're saying like somebody who committed like the most violent crime we can think of, right? Like killing like their own mother. And you're saying 19 years in prison didn't fix that? No, duh, right? Right. And I'm not saying that some people can't go through that process and be transformed, right? But I'm going to imagine that man didn't get the services and the support that he needed to come out on the other side as a better person.
You're probably right.
And so, like, why are we trying to do that again? Like, putting him in jail because he has this idea of violence being the way to solve his problems, specifically against Asian American folks in this specific context, like, that's not going to break that cycle. Like, what are the supports that he needs? Like, I imagine he has immense mental health challenges going on, right? And I'm not saying that's something that community organizations can easily step into and say, like, this is an easy re-education, right? There are like with cases like that are much more nuanced and complicated than either you or I have like knowledge about. I'm not going to be prescriptive about what can happen in that case, but I do know that in general, when there are people who cause harm, right? Like I cause harm in my life. There are needs that I have to still be connected to people who love me, care about me, and want to see me do better. And if we continue to just vilify people as like lost causes or people who are beyond repair, like that's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. And that cycle can never be broken if we constantly feel that way about each other. Going back to your comments about, back in the day when there were only 100 or 150 people in a tribe, you didn't want to just kick them out because they would die. But now we have such polarization and division, within our own communities, right? And then, of course, communities of color being pitted against each other, white supremacy still existing in this country. So that there are days, I got to admit to you, David, there are days when I'm like, we have gone beyond the point of no return. I just feel hopeless. And I know that a lot of my followers and viewers sometimes feel that same way too, that
Yeah.
this has gone so off the rails that the idea of restoring anything is just a pipe dream,
Mhm.
right? So I'm not asking you to like be the healer of all things and have the answers, but when a society gets to that point of being so feeling so helpless and hopeless, and feeling that the divisions are so huge and the anger and the hate is so strong, how do you even get to a point of having this conversation and having even people say, "Oh yeah, let's give this a try," when they're thinking nothing's going to work?
Yeah. I I think like a logical conclusion to that line of like, oh, this is hopeless is strap up, we're going to war, right? And I don't want to live in that world.
I
And so like
know.
in order to do something else, like this has been my approach, right? You talked about, we live in a much more complicated world with so many more people, and we don't need to go into like globalization and immigration and
Yeah.
imperialism and colonization and all of those things, right?
Right.
But we exist in this world where we don't really have to interact with people that we don't choose to interact with, right?
Very
When
true.
we talked a month ago, I asked you, like, do you know the names of your neighbors, right? So much of the conflict that happens in the context of like small communities. And I will admit, I shared with you, like, I moved to where I live right now in the middle of the pandemic. So like I was kind of hampered by the ability to connect with people.
Yeah.
But if I'm able to connect with the people around me and know that, oh, I have a relationship with like Carlos and Daniel who live like on both sides of me, and Juanita who lives two doors down, right? And I can go to them in a time of need, and I know that they'll have my back. Maybe not like they're my best friend and like will give me like the shirt off their back, but like I know that I can go to them for XYZ thing.
Hmm.
I like to think about Mia Mingus. She is a disability and transformative justice activist out of the Bay Area, and she has this idea of pod mapping where people can identify the people in their communities, and please communicate to those people about like them serving those needs for you, right? Having those conversations are what build communities, right? Like this is how we keep each other safe without having to rely on the police. Because I think when we talk about like the police often don't stop harm. They're only responding to
Yeah.
harm that's already happening, right? And their responses to harm, we know the results of that. Like it often looks like death for Black people or other people of color, right? It looks like incarceration, which is not solving problems. So when we're thinking about calling police, like I would challenge people to think, what need are we asking them to actually fulfill? Part of it is like stopping the harm. And if that's the case, I'm not going to stop you from calling the police. If you
Yeah.
don't feel like you have any other resources, like you do what you got to do. But everything else, the police don't really have the infrastructure to offer. And there are people who will say like, we ask police to do too much. That's why their budgets are so big. Great. So like, let's stop asking them to do these things and fund
Yeah.
other things, right? And I'm someone who's like abolished the police, but I understand like the defund the police thing, where it's like, yeah, let's just like reallocate the funds to support communities in ways that they need to be supported
I
that don't
think
require somebody to show up with a badge and a gun.
I think that's the better way to put it. Instead of defunding, I think that's a very negative term. It's reallocating. That's the premise. it's reallocating the resources and the funding to for better use, right? Yes, you still need a police force for protection and to stop crimes and things like that, but you also need resources, psychologists and counselors and drug, rehab, all of that. So it
I
really
mean, an
is reallocation
education and
and
like support
education.
for small businesses, and
Right.
it goes on and on. But I think about the communities where that are most policed, right? They're the communities that don't have those kind of resources. The
Right.
communities that are least policed, they're communities that already have those kinds of resources. And
Right.
so somebody's need to call the police in an affluent suburb is going to be something that's pretty drastic, right? And that those are the situations where I'm saying like, okay, like if you don't feel like you have any other resources, like go ahead and do that. But things that happen in underfunded communities, right, often could have been avoided proactively.
Yeah.
I do dream of a world where police aren't needed, where we have these systems in communities and networks within communities that kind of thing is not needed. I think there's always going to be a role for people who are protecting communities and responding to harm in some kind of way. I don't think it looks like the way that policing is structured right now, where
Mm.
people are policing communities that they don't know anything about, right? They're not members of that community. They're like not as like no shade at anybody in particular, right? But it does not take an incredible amount of education to become a police officer in the United States of America, right? In most cases, you don't need a college degree, right? How are we asking people who don't know a lot about the people that they're working with, or about like the structural ways that policing has been constructed and the history of all these things, to police these communities that they're pretty ill-equipped, like their badge and gun, and like everyone is an op training
Yeah.
to really like quote unquote protect and serve.
Well, so I think we're talking more about EQ and cultural understanding rather than like academic achievement, right? When it comes to policing. So, but let me ask you this one question then, which is, controversial always, which is several of these attacks on Asians have been committed by African Americans. And so that unfortunately is increasing a lot of the anti Black rhetoric
Mhm.
going on. And I see it, I hear it, on social media. And so that certainly is adding to that notion of communities not wanting to work together,
Mhm.
and the divisions getting greater, becoming greater, and then the calls for punishment rather
Mhm.
than something like restorative justice. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard this too, and I'm sure people have maybe challenged you about this as well. So do you have thoughts on how this particular issue can be handled? Because there is a lot of hate talk going on,
Mhm.
between the two communities because of what's happening.
Yeah. For sure. I'm going to ask for grace because I don't have like the sources to back up what I'm about to cite, right? I saw a stat that was talking about how, yes, there are many incidents of these hate crimes that are carried out by African Americans. But that's 5% of what's happening, right? 95% have been carried out by white folks. And why do we see the ones that are carried out by Black folks and people of color? That's a question that I have for quote unquote mainstream media, but I know that's also because those are the communities that are like the most heavily policed, right? And so I would challenge that most of these things are not happening between people of color, right? A lot of it is happening between white people against Asian Americans. So that off the bat. The second thing is like, right, no matter your race, anti-Asian hate violence is unacceptable, right? And we've been fed a narrative through the mainstream media, the history that most of us have learned growing up in school, that Asians are the quote unquote model minority. They are the perpetual foreigner. It's yellow peril. All that, they don't belong here. You had mentioned that I am part Asian. So my mother's Filipino. Her family came here in the 1970s. And then my father is Black, African American. And ancestrally, we've been here since before we remember. He grew up in DC. I live in Southern California now. And so I've always lived, mostly among Latinos because Southern California, right. But like embodying both Black and Asian identity. And that's something that I don't try to separate them, right? It's just like these are two parts of who I am. And there's complicated things about that there's another conversation for another time. But when I think about violence between two communities, I really think about how the construction of white supremacy, right, propping up this myth that Asians are proximal to whiteness,
Yep.
And have it better off than Black folks, is a lie, right? And like that's the lie that we all need to be challenging, and it's not like Black and Asian and Latinx and Indigenous people against white people. It's everybody, right? White folks included, against this idea of white supremacy, and not like marching with the Klan or using racial slurs, but like this idea that whiteness is normal, better, and the standard that we should all be striving to.
Yes.
And when we start to think about the ways that that is enacted in policy, we get to see how we all are struggling against this one thing. And let's work together to, of course, stop the hate, but work towards equity and solidarity.
And I'm glad you said that, David, because I've been saying that repeatedly, and more people are picking up on this narrative of that the white majority and white supremacy, really, they're the ones who came up with the idea of the model minority to pit people of color against each other and compare, right? And that who can raise themselves to the level of Western standards and whiteness. Yeah. And so therefore there is always going to be that tension and that animosity and that anger, right? It's understandable. And I'm going to share something with you and you tell me what you think. It might be controversial, but I don't care because I think this is a conversation that needs to happen. I sometimes think, why is it that African Americans are attacking Asians? Yes, part of it is because those are the videos that go viral, but unfortunately, I'm going to push back a little bit on that. The violent assaults, so many of the violent assaults are actually being committed by African Americans. Unfortunately, that's what I see. Anyway, so I started thinking to myself, why is this? What do I think? And I came up with my own hypothesis. And I thought to myself, well, African Americans have been oppressed and been victimized, by racists for 400 years, right, in this country. 400 years of oppression and racism, and not being given that fair shake. And then they're killed by white cops, or they're abused, or they're assaulted, whatever, on a constant basis. They're constantly, under suspicion for no reason. So that kind of, repressing those feelings has got to get to people after a while, right? And as much as they would love to lash out, especially at the white majority, they know that if they did, they might be killed because they are being killed. Mm-hmm. So that then brings in the whole idea of communities of color being pitted against each other. So who can they lash out at? Because they're so frustrated over all this oppression and racism. Somebody weaker, or perceived weaker.
Right.
Asian elderly, who they already see maybe as you are seen as better than me by the white majority, and you have more than I do. All of these maybe misconceived, notions. But still, that idea of like, I need to take my anger out on somebody, and I'm certainly not going to take it out on white people because I will be killed. So I'm going to take it out on somebody else. Mm-hmm. I know that's a very crude hypothesis, but do you think there's any truth to that? And it stems from frustration. It stems from so much frustration of how they've been treated for so long.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept, right?
Yeah. I mean, this isn't going to make for like the juiciest like responses like far as a hot take goes, but I don't know. Right. Like what comes to mind immediately was like, hurt people.
Yes. Yes.
And you talked about like, Asians being perceived as easy targets, right? Elderly people being perceived as easy targets. And there's something to that. But I also know of Black folks who do all kinds of damaging and harmful things within our own community,
Yeah.
and to other people. And so it's hard for me to say like, yeah, like that's the way that they're channeling that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm certainly not expecting you to affirm this or confirm this hypothesis, but I just try to. I think that maybe this is where you're right in terms of we kind of need to have better understanding of each other, and that can only happen with open conversation and really honest conversation, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. Because if we keep on trying to pussyfoot around things and walk on eggshells, we're never going to see any results.
And I think like one of the things that does bring up, right, is like you're talking about like black men, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's like this enormous amount of like just in general across racial groups, like repressed like ability to like healthily express emotions,
Right.
and that's not exclusive to black men, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
exclusive, like that's often just like a male issue, and like we're not creating the spaces in society for people to express their pain in healthy ways. One of
Right.
the things that I was doing through the Amplify RJ platform, in the wake of the Atlanta shooting, was like just holding communal grief spaces for people to show up for each other and cry and yell and be like, this fucking sucks.
Yeah.
And be in community with people who understand that. And those spaces were 90% women or femmes, right? Because like men, like for some reason, and I know, like I was reflecting, like, would I have showed up to something like this if I didn't already have those relationships? For me, like I have people in my life that I can have like these one-off conversations
Yeah.
with, and like try to start to deal with them. Well, I'm thinking about like my best friends who are Asian. I would say like my dad is obviously my dad is black. But like, I'm able to have like those kind of conversations with those people, but I know not everybody has safety in those
Right.
relationships to be able to do that. And I think that's like, speaking to like the interconnection, right? It's not just racism and white supremacy that we're struggling against. It's like patriarchy and this idea of masculinity
Definitely.
that
That's
is
a
like
whole nother
domination.
issue.
It's a whole
I
nother
mean,
thing,
that
right?
that is a topic that I think is very important because I think boys need to be raised differently. And there's a male problem that goes on in society in terms of what they're expected to be and how they're expected to behave. So that is a whole nother conversation for sure. But
Well, yeah, but I was gonna say, like, when I think about restorative justice, it's not just about that repair of harm piece. It's like, what are the things that we're doing proactively
right.
to like prevent those kind of things from happening? And like, that's where the tie-in is for me. So
Yeah,
it's
no, no,
not
no.
just about those responses to harm. It's
I
like, we can see like why these things are happening, right? Let's do things on the front end to maybe like
Right.
stop it
And
before it happens.
well,
Yeah.
again, David, it's having these conversations that have to be very open and honest and sometimes painful, sometimes embarrassing. Sometimes there's a lot of shame involved and that's why people don't want to address it, but hey, we can't get anywhere without this. And so that's why I appreciate the fact that you and I wanted to have this very frank conversation. So David, I know we could talk about this for hours and hours and so many tangential issues. So we're going to have to maybe do other episodes on these offshoot topics for sure. But I appreciate you coming on, and at least I wanted to introduce the idea of restorative justice to people who aren't familiar with it, and have us all just plant the seed. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen overnight. And some people might completely reject the concept and the notion of it. But at least talking about it, perhaps can make a difference. So,
Yeah, for
yeah,
sure. And like, I think, you know, it's not that society is going to change overnight, but what are the actions that you can take
right.
that are going to like build these relationships, repair these relationships? I want to not mess up Angela Davis's words, but I will do my best to stay as true to them as I can, right?
Right.
Like we have to act as if it were impossible to radically change the world. And we have to do it all the time, right? Even in the face of the anger. And like I'm all for feeling your feelings. Like your feelings are valid. Your want for revenge is warranted. And I understand where that comes from. But what needs is it really meeting, right? What are we like really working towards if we're continuing to utilize these cycles of violence another way as possible.
Right, right. Okay, well, on that note, we will bring this great interview to a close. David, you have the most awesome name, David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris. That's your
All
full
five
name,
names for
right?
the ancestors. Yes.
Nice. I love
Yeah.
it. I love it. Okay. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate the conversation. Keep doing the work that you're doing because it's really, truly important. And let's talk again.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of being informative, educational to a certain extent, so that you have a better understanding what restorative justice is about. It's still a concept that is being tossed around. It's not fully adopted and accepted, in obviously a lot of places, but people are starting to consider it. And like we mentioned in the interview, the Asian man in Oregon who was assaulted by this white man wanted his assailant to go through restorative justice instead of the traditional punitive actions taken against someone like that. So it is something that we're hearing more about, and that's why I wanted to talk about it and at least have a better understanding about it. We need healing. We need better understanding. We do need that concept, more of that concept of community building and cultural understanding and just even knowing your neighbor. So if that is what something like restorative justice can promote, instead of just relying on the policing aspect all the time and the incarceration, maybe that it's some sort of hybrid, right? Combination. But any step towards healing and better understanding and peace would be helpful and would be welcomed, I think, by all of us. No argument there. Just one mention about David and the work that they do. So his website is amplifyrj.com. And he and his group also do different trainings and workshops. And for instance, they have a restorative interventions and responses to anti-Asian violence coming up on April 17th. And then the following Saturday, they have something called Unlearning Anti-Blackness and the Model Minority Myth. But if you go to the website, amplifyrj.com, you can find all that information about some of their workshops, events, and other educational seminars that they do. Okay, so I hope you enjoy that episode. Oh, one last thing. I know some of the things that we talked about in this episode may have been a little bit controversial, or maybe some of you found it offensive in some ways. And what I want to say is that sometimes we do need to touch on these subjects that are sensitive, that, may raise an eyebrow or more, because we need to have these conversations that are tough. We need to bring up these issues that oftentimes are not spoken about because of the fear of backlash or offending somebody or a community. And so, hopefully we treated this subject and the things around it in a sensitive enough way that all of you who are listening and watching understand what our intentions were by talking about these ideas and concepts and hypotheses that I shared as well. So, but listen, I want to hear from you. Please let me know what you thought. So you can write to me on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, of course. And if you haven't started following the show, please do on YouTube and, of course, all the social media platforms. So thank you for the support. And I love the feedback, good or bad. I can take it. Okay. All right, everyone, take care. And until next time, I'll see you soon.